Welcome to this week's edition of Film Shocks with Hitchcock, my year-long journey with the master of suspense. Today we're talking about the final Alfred Hitchcock film of the 1920s. It's Blackmail from 1929. It's not just the last Alfred Hitchcock film of the 1920s, it's also the first so-called Talkie film from Hitchcock's filmography. That's right, Blackmail is a sound movie, the first one that we've done on the show so far, the first one Hitchcock ever did, and it was also the first successful Talkie in Britain because it was the first Talkie film in Britain. There's some disputes about that. There's another film titled Kitty from 1929 that some people claim was the first Talkie, but technically this movie was finished first, it was released first. I don't know if Kitty started production first. Wherever that dispute comes from, no. It's Hitchcock's Blackmail. It was very popular in 1929. In fact, it was considered the best film of 1929 by British audiences. It's also cool that this shows up in my book of 1001 movies you should watch before you die. Now, I have the 2012 edition. I don't know if there's been changes since then, if they've added other early Hitchcock films to the newer editions. I'm kind of shocked that The Lodger doesn't appear on the list. If they've made that change recently, please let me know. But from my understanding, Blackmail is the earliest Hitchcock film on the list, and I think it deserves it. It's a very entertaining film, moves at a quick pace, wraps things up in under an hour and a half. So for Hitchcock to make a film in the 1920s that wraps things up under an hour and a half, that's shocking. If you've been listening to the previous episodes, you would know the 1920s movies weren't the best at trimming things down. However, it was initially going to be shot as a silent film, but the producers, seeing the success of The Jazz Singer, changed their mind and decided that they were going to make the final reel of the film a sound movie. Now, Hitchcock liked the idea, but he was already thinking that the producers were going to change their minds and want the entire thing in sound. So instead, he shot the entire film in sound, argued his case, and in the meantime, they also made a silent version of the film. So there's actually two movies here, the sound version and the silent version, and there's actually some differences between them both. They didn't just take the sound out and add some intertitles. There's actually key differences in the choices that were made for each distinct version. One of the characters is played by two different actors. In the sound version, the chief inspector is played by Harvey Braben, but in the silent version, he's played by Sam Livesey. And before we get too far, I want to do some fact-checking for some of the previous episodes. I recently was on Instagram. I follow the Alfred Hitchcock page, and they uploaded the poster for The Farmer's Wife, and they stated that it was released in February of 1929. That goes against what was listed on Letterboxd and what I had read. I have read that the film was released in 1928. So, once again, they're already switching dates around for some of these movies, even when I've just done the episodes. It's only been a month. The same thing already happened with Easy Virtue. I mentioned that last week. They, for some reason, changed the date of the release on Letterboxd from 1928 to 1926. I don't even know where that information comes from, but we'll never really know with some of these silent movies. I don't know if they were taking many generous notes about the differences between the production dates, the release dates, and the premiere dates, but I'm following what Letterboxd says. And after Blackmail, the information is a lot more concrete, so we shouldn't have to worry anymore about suddenly changing the release dates after only a few weeks of doing an episode. Anyway, so Blackmail was based on Charles Bennett's play from 1928. It opens with a spinning wheel of a car, as we are introduced to one of the main characters, Frank Weber. He's a detective, and he's on the case. We're immediately thrown into the arrest of some criminal. We don't know anything about what he's done. All we know is that when the police show up, he nearly tries to grab his gun, only to be grabbed, stopped, handcuffed. They do his fingerprints, they bring him to a judge, and they throw him in jail. It's another day's work for Frank Weber. However, his girlfriend, Alice White, is waiting outside, and she claims to have been waiting a half hour for him to be done with work. Clearly, the man is in love with his job, but doesn't have as much time for a girlfriend. They go out to eat at a very busy establishment. They find a seat, and there's a bit of a comedic moment here where the girlfriend sits down, but a different couple also comes to the table, and the man from that couple also sits down. So both couples are at a standstill waiting for one or the other to move, and then both of them leave at the same time after they catch different open tables. So essentially they both chicken out, and then the table is left open anyway. Once they do find a seat, there's a lot of commotion going on, a lot of arguing. Frank and Alice clearly are not getting along, and they end the night going separate ways. Frank is played by John Longden, and we'll be seeing him in a couple upcoming Hitchcock movies, but this is his first one. Alice White is played by Annie Andra, who is the main leading girl in The Manxman. Now, here's the thing about Annie Andra. This is a sound movie, but from reading about the production, she has a Czech accent, something that Hitchcock didn't think was going to work for a sound film. So they actually developed a process where her voice would be dubbed, except back in 1929, they didn't really have a dubbing process. They actually had a different actress, Joan Barry, do the lines from outside the frame of the camera, and Annie Andra basically would have to match the sound of Joan's voice with her lips. A very difficult process, but somehow they made it work. Granted, it makes the performance at times, especially with the dialogue, a bit awkward. But once you see her performance with the moments where she just needs to stare at the camera, especially during some of the more intense and depressing moments, you can understand why Annie Andra was the most necessary actress to play this role. When Alice and Frank part ways, Alice meets a painter, Mr. Crew. They go on a date and eventually walk home. He invites her upstairs and wants to show off some of his paintings and other works. She goes with him, and at first, things are fine. He's a piano player, he has a dress that he wants her to try on, and they do a painting together, which Alice signs. Now, in the sound version, there's actually a piano in the room that he plays, but in the silent version, there is no piano. I guess that kind of added to the novelty of the Talkie. If you took the time to seek out a sound version of this movie, you were going to be getting that extra little detail in the film, the piano, which you can now actually hear. It's not just some live orchestra playing along with the music. You can actually hear the music of the piano in the film itself. I should mention that this film utilizes a process called photophone. It's where the sound of the film is actually put on the film itself. It's different from the Vitaphone process, which has the sound on a separate disc. Because they would put the music on the film itself, that would actually lessen the amount of space for the visual part of the film. So instead of having the normal, at the time, 1.33 by 1 aspect ratio, it was actually a 1.2 by 1 aspect ratio. Anyways, it's clear that Mr. Crew has an affection for Alice, something that she doesn't return. He forcefully kisses her, she backs away, and when she decides to change out of the dress that he provided her, he actually steals away her other clothing. He's playing around, but things get pretty intense quickly. Just as a trigger warning to anyone out there who might be wanting to watch this film, there is a rape scene in this. Now, for me, as far as having a scene like that in any movie, I have heard arguments where people say, no matter what, if you have a scene like that, it's exploitive. And I can understand that. I almost agree for the most part, especially for most films that I've seen that have a scene like this. I have to say that, given that it's the 1920s, clearly they couldn't go too far with it. I'm still a little shocked by just how often Hitchcock got away with undressing the women in his films, but I guess it was before the Hays Code. We do see her undress, obviously not nude, but enough where I'm shocked that the 1920s could get away with this, given that films from the late 30s and 40s ended up more conservative. But yes, it does lead to that moment, and there's a scuffle, they're pushed into bed, but all we see from the outside of the bed, because there's drapes, the whole bed is covered, and we only see her hand flailing, and it's trying to grab at anything she can find. And she does find a knife that's right next to the bed. The knife is left there because there's some bread. Is that a normal thing to have a bread and knife by the bed? Maybe it's a 1920s thing. I don't know. But she grabs a knife and stabs him. We don't see any of this on screen. So in a way, I don't find it to be that exploitive. In fact, given what we've seen from other movies with moments like this and how it pans out for the rest of the plot, I'm shocked that a lot of the traditional tropes that we see, some of those negative tropes that we're tired of seeing, aren't utilized here. But we'll get into that in a moment. She gets out of bed and we see that there is blood on the knife. You actually see blood. She's freaking out. She cleans up the place. She removes her name from the painting by, covering it up with more paint. She leaves. The landlady from below hears the scuffle. She goes upstairs after Alice leaves and realizes that he's been murdered. It just so happens that Frank is the detective on this case. When Frank arrives at the scene, he's looking for clues and happens to find a glove with holes in it. Here's the problem. Earlier, when they were out at dinner, he made a comment about Alice's gloves always having holes in them. Well, the glove that he found at this apartment happens to have holes in it. He ends up hiding the evidence in his pocket and decides not to bring it up. He's already figured it out. The audience already knows, and Frank has discovered it with us. Alice committed the murder. Alice goes home, and her family happens to run a shop. It's morning breakfast, and she's obviously in a complete daze about everything that's happened. These are the scenes that are very effective and makes you understand why Annie Andra was kept in the role. The best part is that Hitchcock's already utilizing that sound to an effective degree. I believe Alice's mother is talking, and while she's talking, we don't really hear any of it. It's all muffled in the background. But every time she says the word knife, because whatever she's talking about, she keeps mentioning knives. Every time she says knife or knives, that is enunciated. That's loud, while everything else she says is muffled. We only have a shot of Alice as this entire dialogue's going on. It's confronting her. It's messing with her. She's terrified of what she's done. And then her father asks her if she'll cut some bread. Well, she's got to use a knife for that. And while doing so, she jumps and tosses the knife. You totally buy that this is a woman who just committed murder. Frank arrives at the store and confronts Alice about what happened. But before he can get too far, somebody else arrives at the store and happens to have some information about the murder. A man named Tracy enters the store, and he sees from the window that Frank is talking to Alice and showing off the gloves. It just so happens that Tracy has the other glove. He saw what was going on the night before, and he decided to go to the crime scene himself. He took one of the gloves and he followed Frank, knowing that the other glove was missing, and he assumed there was a cover-up going on. He pieces everything together and decides to blackmail them, mostly for petty things, like he gets food out of them. He's only messing with them at first, but eventually Frank catches on that this man might be just as in trouble as Alice is, because the police have only one suspect at the moment, and it happens to be Tracy. So it's a matter of who's going to back down first. It's my word against yours for both parties. Well, when the police arrive, Tracy chickens out, jumps out the window, and there's a marvelous chase sequence through the British Museum. They end up on the roof, and Tracy tries to make his case. However, he's standing on a glass roof and happens to break through one of the panels, falling to his death. Alice is feeling guilty about the entire thing and decides to give herself up to the police. It's only by happenstance that she's not able to explain things fast enough. All the policemen are busy, and when Frank shows up, he stops her and explains that Tracy has fallen to his death and they believe he committed the murder. So she's in the clear, or is she? The movie ends on her feeling a little relieved, only to look behind her and see evidence from Mr. Crew's home being brought into the police station, including one of the paintings of a jester that she was laughing at earlier. Now that painting's not so funny, and all that guilt comes rushing back, and the movie ends. It's a pretty dark way to end the film, to realize that this woman who committed a murder by self-defense is riddled with guilt. It's not a happy ending for anyone, and is in tone with the type of films that Hitchcock makes. This one has it all. It has murdered. It has a wrongly accused suspect. It has a chase sequence. This is everything that we will see in so many Hitchcock movies to come. I enjoyed myself quite a lot while watching this, even if the story was pretty condensed. There's not a whole lot to this. It's just about somebody who commits a murder in self-defense. Somebody else finds out about it, attempts blackmail, but barely gets into it before they get blamed for the murder themselves, and they run away because they get scared. They're worried that they're going up against a detective and that his word's going to mean nothing against the person who works for law enforcement. The movie only runs at 86 minutes, and things wrap up pretty quickly. In fact, the movie is called Blackmail. I mean, the play was too. I'm not exactly sure if there's a whole lot of differences between the movie itself and the play, but for being called Blackmail, the blackmail portion of it is hardly there. Now, there is the silent version, which ran at 76 minutes, which actually was even more popular when it was released. It even ran in theaters for a longer time, but that's probably because most theaters weren't equipped for sound yet in 1929. The silent film is sometimes considered to be the better of the two. I kind of question that though, because Hitchcock was always pretty conservative about how many intertitles he adds. He didn't overboard the film with unnecessary dialogue. However, since this film is a sound movie, there is a lot more intertitles in the silent version than there's typically been in some of the previous silent Hitchcock movies. I guess I can understand, though, that, like a lot of early sound movies, there's actually very little talking in them. For the most part, they rely on either sound effects or just playing out scenes without dialogue as much as possible. But usually there wouldn't be music to accompany it. For some reason, once things went to sound, they decided that, well, we don't need to fill the entire movie with music anymore. It makes everything awkward. There's just long pauses. There's long takes. However, I think the sound movie has a better excuse for being watched versus the silent film. It has the piano sequence in it, whereas the silent version doesn't. Granted, there's a different shot sequence for that particular moment in the silent version versus the sound, but I don't know, I like the way the sound version plays out better. I like that this guy is playing piano while the woman awkwardly undresses and tries on a dress. Also, the sound version has the best scene in the film, which is when the mother is repeatedly saying the word knife, and those are the only words enunciated for Alice. In her mind, she's only hearing the word knife over and over and over again. It's piercing hers and the audience's ears. In the silent film, you don't get that. You get some intertitles, you get some music, and she still tosses the knife out of fear, but it doesn't make as much sense. It's not as effective as it is in the sound movie. And yeah, I do like the ending of the movie, but after reading about the original ending, I wish that would have been done instead. Basically, everything was still going to play out the same way. Tracy was going to get wrongly accused. He would fall to his death. But then Alice actually was going to confess. She would get arrested, and basically it would be a repeat of everything that happened in the first scene of the movie, when Frank was booking a random criminal. But this time he would be booking Alice. He would even be asked the same question by one of his coworkers as they leave the station for the day. Because in the beginning of the movie, he asks, "Are you going out with that girl tonight?" He was going to ask that again at the end of the film, but of course the audience knows, no, this guy is not going out with his girlfriend tonight. She's in jail. I don't know, I think that would be a neat ending. I love when movies can do that, where the first scene can mirror the last scene. The only thing that the first scene is there for is to give you an idea of what Frank's job is. It's an interesting sequence of shots, but it doesn't really add a whole lot to the overall picture unless you have the original ending there. But don't let that detract. This film is still a 3.5 out of 5-star movie. So for the 1920s, it's one of the better Hitchcock films. And of this era, I think my favorite Hitchcock movies were this, Easy Virtue, and The Lodger, which, funnily enough, are the only ones that had the famous Hitchcock cameo. Hitchcock does cameo in this one. It's one of the longer cameos that he had. He's on the bus, and a boy is messing around with his hat, and Hitchcock's getting pissed off. This is probably him at his most noticeable so far. Now, before we wrap up the episode, I want to say, I watched the Kino Blu-ray edition of this film. It's a 2-disc set, and that got me excited. I was like, hey, 2 discs. What's so special about this movie that it needs 2 discs? Is there like a documentary? Is there some extended special feature or interview or anything? Like, what is in this set? Well, basically, the first disc has the silent version and the sound version, and then the second disc has the sound version again. Except this time, it's the one 1.2 by 1 aspect ratio, which is the original aspect ratio it should be presented in. Now, why would they do that? Well, on the first disc, somebody screwed up. Basically, they took the sound version and they stretched it out horizontally to fit a 1.33 by 1 aspect ratio. A lot of silent movies were shot in 1.33 by 1. A lot of other early movies were. But the sound version was not, because, as I mentioned earlier, with the photophone process, it was impossible to have a wider aspect ratio than 1.2 by 1. Now, for some reason, someone at Kino screwed up. They horizontally stretched the film. So rather than fixing the disc, they decided to just add another disc to the set. That must have been the cheapest way to fix the problem. So they added this 1.2 by 1 sound version, which is the only version that should exist for the sound film. But then somebody noticed that they screwed up again, because they actually stretched it too far. They started to vertically stretch it. Because on the first disc, all the characters looked too wide. But when they tried to fix it, they actually made all the characters start to look way too thin. I don't know exactly what they did to try and fix it, but basically, when they attempted to fit it for a 1.2 by 1 aspect ratio, they instead got it more so to a 1.12 by 1 aspect ratio. So, the Kino totally screwed it up. Apparently, they never did a disc replacement program, and some people have said they were successful in getting a replacement disc. I don't have any proof of that, and even the version that I have is one that I bought 2 years after the initial release. Even watching it on my TV, I wasn't quite sure if it was vertically stretched. It was kind of hard to tell unless I actually did the measurements myself. I didn't. It looked fine enough, so possibly they fixed the problem. But I just want everyone to know that initially when Blackmail was released by Kino, it was wrong on both counts. They tried to fix it with a new disc, and then they screwed it up again anyway. And I think it's still screwed up. Even the version I watched was probably screwed up. I want to give credit to Brenton Films for pointing that out. Brenton Films has been the go-to for everything regarding home video releases of Hitchcock films, and they're one of the few people that actually spotted the problem. Well, that's pretty much everything I have for Blackmail. 1929, I highly recommend it. That ends the 1920s for Hitchcock, and then next week, we'll be talking about his Irish comedy. Yeah, he did an Irish comedy, Juno and the Paycock. Fortunately, there's not a Blu-ray release of this film. It is available on the Mill Creek so-called public domain set, even though none of the Hitchcock films are public domain. Go to Brenton Films if you want more information on that. But yes, Juno and the Paycock will be next week. I will do my best to find the highest quality version of the film that's out there, and we'll also briefly discuss Elm Street Calling. Not that that's a Hitchcock film, he only directed some short moments in it, but it's still something that Hitchcock did, so I think it's going to be worth talking about. Even though when Hitchcock was asked about Elm Street Calling in the Truffaut book, he stated, and I quote, "of no interest whatsoever." And that's it. That was everything they discussed about Elm Street Calling. Thanks for listening to this episode. Let me know what you think of Blackmail. Let me know what you thought of some of the previous Hitchcock films and what you expect in future episodes. Let me know what you think of the show in general, Hitchcock in general, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes my part of the program. Next time, I shall return with another story.